Hello. So my name is Ludwig Siegel. I cover technology for the Economist. So if you want to talk about that later during the break, happy to explain to you what we're doing at the Economist and why we're writing about the blockchain, or not so much anymore. You already know two of our panelists here, but let's give the other two the opportunity to introduce yourself. So why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Hi everyone, thanks so much for inviting me to this event. My name is Christian Lundqvist. I work for a company called Consensus, which is a venture production studio. So we have a lot of internal projects in the blockchain space using mainly the Ethereum blockchain. And the idea is to work very horizontally to find industry experts in various different industries and team up with them to build decentralized applications. So we have projects going on in energy and music, finance, a lot of different things. So my main project is identity. We're building an identity system called Uport. And we recently announced a collaboration with Ryan here and another small company called Microsoft. So that's going to be very exciting. So we're building a cross-blockchain identity system. Thank you.
Thanks, Christian. Ryan, so blockchain or Blockstack Labs, tell me more. And
Sure.
Of course, about what you deal with Microsoft.
Absolutely. So, hi everyone. My name is Ryan Shea, and I'm one of the co-founders of Blockstack Labs, which works on Blockstack, which is a decentralized application stack for the new internet, which is secure, blockchain secured, and it provides services like naming, identity, authentication, and then user-centric storage. As Christian mentioned, we actually just announced yesterday a partnership with Microsoft and Consensus, where we'll be collaborating on a self-sovereign user-centric identity system. And you might know me as one of the creators of OneName, and OneName is a consumer web application that was built on top of Blockstack, this blockchain application stack. So.
Well, you started out as OneName, I think. So why that change? Is that
sure?
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a name change, or
It's just a name change. I mean, we still have OneName, our consumer product at onename.com, but Blockstack, we built out Blockstack as the application platform underneath OneName, and we wanted to focus more on the application stack, more on what we're providing to developers and companies, and just show that OneName is one of many possible applications that could be built on top of the technology. So.
Cool. I mean, one thing you mentioned, Trent and Juan, very often is kind of the emerging stack of kind of these decentralized applications, for these decentralized applications. Interesting thing, hadn't heard that before, but tell me, how far along are we? Is this just a collection of projects that find kind of a common name like Interplanetary? Where are you actually?
I think the stack has been, it's not like a new stack in a sense in that we're replacing the functions of different things in the past. So in general, the way that protocols work is they layer nicely to provide different pieces of functionality, right? And as Trent talked about, storage layer underneath computation, and then like being able to have networking to be able to talk to different groups and so on. And I think all the pieces are there already, right? And Bitcoin was this nice catalyst for getting us to rethink the stack of applications that we have. When we think about how web applications work today, there's this massive machine that everyone has to run with tons of little computers and so on to just provide the service for one web application that oftentimes could just be replaced by an Ethereum script, and that's it, right? And so I think all of the pieces are there. Like, there's great solutions for payments. There are great solutions for computation. The identity pieces are getting worked out by the two people here. There's, of course, file systems and databases and so on. And all of the pieces are there. I think right now we're just rewiring how they all fit together and work together. And ultimately, it's going to be the applications that drive the development forward. So it's finding those really killer applications that are going to drive the use of all of these pieces, right? So Bitcoin was nice because it had this inbuilt payments application platform. All the other blockchains have that too, but we need something even deeper and more user-facing and consumer-oriented that is going to just surface all of the benefits of this kind of new way of looking at data and computation that is publicly verifiable, shared, with no organizations in the middle. And once we find that, that the rest is going to just go really quickly because all of the infrastructure has been, like, is in the last phases now.
Ryan, do you agree with that? And what do you think can be the kind of the killer app to drive that, the adoption of that new stack?
Oh yeah, absolutely agree. I think it's a little difficult to know. I mean, we're seeing quite a few applications being built on top of all these technologies, but it's hard to predict what's going to come out and be the big ones. I think it'll be applications where there is a particularly strong advantage of building it on top of something like this. So in a case where, I think if you take a look at something like an encrypted, end-to-end encrypted messaging app, there's quite a few UX challenges that with these applications. Like if you guys use Signal, you may notice that you have to link, like actually when you're talking to someone, there's a link between the person's name and their phone number, right? And then there's also a link to a public key, right? And in a sense, you're trusting Signal to form that association. What Signal will do is every time that the public key changes, it'll notify you and ask you to authenticate the public key. But you don't really know what's going on, and so if you want a truly secure application that works with the user, then you need to use some of these systems that allow for you to actually trust the information, right? Trust that you're getting the exactly right data, like with IPFS. Trusting that you're getting the exact correct user, like you are with some identity systems, like what we have and what Consensus has. And so I think it's really going to be the applications that shine because they couldn't have been built in a certain way without these technologies.
Christian, same question to you. Do you think there is something like a stack emerging, and what could be the killer app?
Yeah, I think there is a stack emerging, but I also think that it's very early days. So we're seeing a lot of pieces. So IPFS is one piece, BigchainDB is one piece. Blockchains, whether it be Bitcoin or Ethereum, is another piece. And I think we still have a ways to go before we figure out what is the right way to link up all these technologies. And I would also say here, centralized services is one piece that they have very big advantages, which is why they're so popular. But if we can scale them down so that they're used for just the things that they are best at, then I think we get a very good stack. But I think one of the big challenges is that we're thinking a lot about is user experience, and this was also something that Ryan mentioned. If we have a system where you interact with a blockchain, and if you want the user to be empowered, then they have to control their own private keys, and that is something that's never really been done before, because keys has always been some administrator and some company that handles that. And so to create the UX around that is something that we're seeing as a big challenge.
Johan, I'm just wondering, isn't the challenge here that you have a centralized system that actually works quite well? I mean, you've laid out the reason why it doesn't, but if let's say, have a decentralized database, interplanetary database, and compare that to an already interplanetary but centralized database Google is operating, I'd bet my money, at least at this point, on Google. So how can that change? Trent, perhaps?
Sure. So actually, and maybe this ties back to the previous question of that's emerging stack. Another way to frame the emerging stack is you have a stack that exists that's centralized, or several stacks, right? You know, the LAMP stack of the late 90s to a variety of ones today. And you can build a centralized app and then say, okay, let's decentralize this piece, et cetera, right? And it makes it easier to sort of have this adoption, and you know, UX issues have been resolved. Towards, then the question is, okay, what is the benefit? Like, you should only use decentralized if there's a benefit, right? Otherwise, you're wasting your time, right? So, you know, the case that we started with Ascribe, everything was centralized except for just the who owned what, right? Because if you're a little startup and you have a database of who owns what and you go kaput, then, you know, people are buying digital art on your platform and you go kaput, they lose their digital art, right? It's a little different, you know, you don't have reputation yet, you don't have sort of trust. If you're Apple and you're giant, you have trust because you have a long history and you probably won't go broke in the next 5 years. So you know, if I buy a song through iTunes, then I can probably be pretty sure that I still kind of own it through Apple and the licensing there. So it really has to solve a specific problem, and a lot of it comes down to basically, it's a way for the little guy to get a proxy for trust. Rather than, you know, relying on size and scale. There's a whole bunch of other, you know, key use cases, but that's a really important one.
And one way that we're actually thinking about the stack is very similar to how Juan thinks about it, where a lot of the components are swap-outable, I mean, I mentioned before that Blockstack, in a sense, it's its own stack, but you know, it provides naming, identity, authentication, and user storage. But the way we look at it is that the actual location where the data can be stored is independent, right? It can be stored in IPFS, it can be stored in other locations, and then also the system actually has a directory, right? That it builds off of either a blockchain or some other ledger, and it's also blockchain agnostic. So I think it's very important that we think of things in a way where we are not hard coding in certain components, and we can actually swap them out.
Let me push you on that more generally. I mean, you said kind of centralization where it's good, decentralization where it serves the purpose. I mean, more generally, for you, it sometimes seems to me in this whole decentralization debate that decentralization is a goal. We want to have a blockchain. We want to have a decentralized database. And that kind of is missing the point. It's a tool. So any thoughts on that, perhaps? Yeah, right.
Sure. I think that we often talk about decentralization, but there's a lot of derivative properties that are related to decentralization, and you know, it comes down to not having to rely on a single entity for uptime. It comes down to not having to trust a single entity for pieces of information. It allows you to escape censorship, right? It allows you to make sure that large organizations can cooperate with one another and actually have a, for example, authentication system that works amongst them without having to delegate to one particular organization. So it's also something that very large organizations find attractive because they can then work with each other in a neutral playing field. So I think there are a lot of derivative properties. Like decentralization in of itself is more of like an ideological thing, or it's an abstract concept that's really hard to pin down. But there's so many derivative advantages that we get, and it depends on the system and it depends on the application, and you should think about that in context. So if it's a messaging application, then you care about maybe having privacy, it being not censorable, and so on. For example, in any country where there's some kind of uprising, you need that property. So that's how I think about it.
When we think about these systems and where they're going to have how they're going to actually get deployed and beat some of the other competitors that are right now enormous and dominate the space, is you have to think about the unfair advantages that these systems have, right? And people mention trust and identity and so on. That's a huge one, like being able to use a system without having to trust that the corporation is going to be around in 5 years or 10 years. Sure, Google and Apple and so on we've seen that they've been around, but anything could happen in these networks. Like Google shuts down services often. Many services that you used are now gone. We need to transition our application stack to one where users do not have to depend on an organization continuing to find that as like a very valuable profit model, in that if a large collection of users want to continue running this thing, they should be able to do it. I think one killer application, or not exactly application, but one killer business opportunity in this space is to think about cloud computing, right? So traditionally, we think about cloud computing in terms of the giants, Google, Amazon, and so on. The people that can afford to build out massive data centers and wire up all these computers and do all the processing. However, when you think about the Bitcoin hash rate and how many computers today are wired up crunching hashes to maintain the ledger, it's an enormous computing power. It defies any kind of expectation that people had before, just how much processing is dedicated to maintaining this one ledger. And it raises this amazing question of saying, if we could convince so much cheap power to emerge, to be dedicated to maintaining this network, what other kinds of networks can we maintain this way? What properties do you gain by doing so, right? So Google and Amazon are not going to build totally distributed data centers where you have one machine in this room that they're deploying. Maybe that is where they're headed, but right now they're certainly not there. So you have the ability to create something like what Airbnb and Uber did to really get in with everyone that's distributed around the world precisely where they're needed most to build out an infrastructure for computing. So I actually think that this might seem like the totally contrarian point of view here, because cloud computing is such the secret sauce of these major corporations. But I think there's a huge Achilles heel in all of this, which is that the major corporations have to deal with bandwidth being an enormously expensive thing. And if you can beat them and go directly to the edge, that is a killer application or a killer business.
So yeah, can I quickly jump in? I think from what Paul was saying also is that right now it seems that the killer application is actually monetary and financial. I mean, you saw it with, the reason why we have this world's biggest supercomputer is that these people get paid for running these Bitcoin miners, and we also seen in the Ethereum space, the biggest thing right now is the DAO. So I don't know if Christoph is here, and yes, he will talk more about that later. But it's basically a $150-something million decentralized VC fund that emerged, and I think these kinds of systems where people can just go in and allocate capital, allocate resources spontaneously. I mean, I think there is such tremendous power and potential there. We haven't really started scratching the surface of that.
Can I build on that?
Okay.
Super quickly. One of the interesting properties here is the ability to create markets where there wasn't a market before, right? So we think of companies like Google, Amazon, Airbnb, and Uber as a centralized entity that's creating a market underneath them in certain cases. But what application platforms on top of Ethereum and IPFS and IPDB and so on and Blockstack can do is suddenly cut out this huge middleman with a protocol. And that's a massive cost savings for the entire network. So one thing that has been talked about a lot is what happens when you can do things like Airbnb and Uber without this central service. It may be the sort of thing that UX is so vital and important that you need this entity to do the market making or to create the market. But it may be that that's not the case, and that you can turn this into a protocol that will optimize the entire process much faster than a centralized company would do it, because it turns it into a market. The moment that you can take a very complicated process and translate it into a market where a whole bunch of different actors can vie for opportunities and just beat each other, you have this amazing optimization power where it'll just fit the function much better than a centralized entity could have.
So one more question before, I'm going to ask one more question before I turn it to the audience. Though, yes, you talked about kind of centralized services, you talked about markets, you talked about institutions we have to trust. So in a way, centralization pops up all the time. Then you get a governance problem. And the DAO, for example, is a good example. Bitcoin is a good example. You always get that governance problem. So any thoughts on that? So if you organize this interplanetary file system or database, foundation you mentioned, how are you going to run it? How are you going to avoid getting into that governance crisis Bitcoin is in right now?
So I grew up in a place in rural Canada that's colder than Siberia, called Saskatchewan, and people basically had to work together. If they didn't, they'd literally die from the cold. And how they did it was via a governing vehicle called co-ops. So there was a co-op for the local grocery store. There's a co-op for selling grain. Actually, it's billions of dollars worth of sales through this co-op in Saskatchewan called the Saskatchewan Wheat Pool. And it had these governing structures, right? And kind of the way that I see governance moving forward, you can kind of come from the angle of starting with blockchain and decentralization and try to figure out the legals on top of that. And that's fine. It's hard though, like we've been seeing with the DAO, you know, after it was released, there's little challenges here and there. They will get resolved, but it'll take time. You can also start with the existing legal structures that work really well, that have been proven over the centuries even, and you can add in elements of decentralization here and there and here and there, and work with the existing legal frameworks. And I think that's actually a powerful way to think about it. A lot of DAOs are extremely well suited to the notion of a co-op. So you can kind of go from both angles. What we chose with IPDB was actually to take the traditional route to start with, knowing that there could be challenges with the other way. But as time goes on, as the challenges of DAOs, et cetera, get resolved, then to essentially, eventually, dissolve the current governance of IPDB. So it will take time. We're excited, but there is a lot of existing legal frameworks that can be leveraged intelligently.
Thanks, Trent. So, questions from the audience. Who wants to be the first one? Over here.
I'll go for it. So, I'm trying to think, my name is Ken Berger, Farm Labs. So there's a paradox of the commons. I guess I'm one, and I've heard this, if I'm quoting that right, throughout the years, you always want to, the internet is supposed to be a bunch of nodes, but really you wind up getting these big hubs that take control. What is the biggest threat, the single biggest threat that any of you see, to the general topic of rewiring the internet for decentralization? Is it technical, is it governmental, is it blah, 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 blah?
One thing is, I think we need to be careful to remember that these things, decentralization, etc., it's not always a good thing. I mean, blockchains are extremely empowering because they mean that you can hold assets, etc., in a self-sovereign way, but they also have very difficult privacy issues. So I think one threat is that if we don't design our systems very carefully, we might end up in a worse situation, let's say privacy-wise, than we're in right now. So this is something we need to remember.
My biggest fear is if you go to the early 1900s, JP Morgan, Rockefeller and all these guys, they created things like US Steel and Standard Oil and all these major trusts. I'm super concerned about that. I'm really concerned that a lot of these consortium chains will end up being too powerful and cut out the little guys. So we've been thinking long and hard about that. How do you balance, sharing resources within an ecosystem, within an industry, and at the same time making things accessible to the little guys who weren't part of that initial club? I fear a lot about that. There had to be laws introduced in the early 1900s to basically stop these trusts, but it took decades. So that's my greatest fear.
I think one big risk that we run is, and I actually haven't seen it that much, so that's good, is that a lot of this kind of change started happening in the early 2000s with the peer-to-peer networks that emerged then. The problem, though, is that the majority of the use cases there were bad in that some of them were illegal in some way, some of them were not well tuned to the actual problem they were solving. And so what you ended up with was a huge regulatory backlash to counteract all of these kinds of networks and just systematic destruction of multiple groups that were trying to build these kinds of networks and technologies. And a few of them survived, right? So I'm sure that you have used Skype. Skype started as, the same team did Kazaa previously, right? And so that was kind of a problem, so then they shut that down, moved on, and created Skype. And then they actually had to rethink the whole peer-to-peer thing and not really use it as much marketing because the words peer-to-peer became synonymous with illegal in many different kinds of jurisdictions. And even today, we still have this holdover where, for example, our website, ipfs.io, is blocked in some universities because it has the words peer-to-peer. Universities that have CS departments that are really good, who should know better. The internet is peer-to-peer, IP is peer-to-peer, email is peer-to-peer in a way, right? So it's just kind of like this problem where the hubris of the early groups cause them to really ride the wave of all these like problematic use cases that then cause this, in lots of ways warranted, in other ways not so warranted, massive backlash that just killed the space. And so we might face challenges like that coming up. There are certain things that will emerge out of these networks and so on that will be hard to control, and hard to control in ways that governments will be kind of scared by deeply. And if we are not careful with the applications that we start building and the way we are presenting this to the rest of the world and the messaging, we might face this kind of similar kind of ignorant backlash against a lot of the things, and just we might see, for example, like tomorrow we could see cryptocurrency banned, right? Like in some countries, wholesale, instead of actually thinking about the nuance behind each cryptocurrency and so on. And that kind of like quick reaction might happen if we are not careful with the applications we distribute.
I'll just quickly say, my big concern is that we don't get the UX and distribution right, and we don't go to mass market.
I mean, you said that there was kind of a systematic destruction of everything P2P. I'm just wondering, is that true? I mean, I remember, I'm now rather aged, when I arrived in the Valley in the early 90s, the talk was quite similar. We went to kind of an EFF event, decentralization. It didn't turn out that way. Kind of the economics drove this to centralization. So I'm just wondering whether that's kind of not kind of a pendulum swinging back and forward, and that kind of we need both. We may, I mean, the systems we have are actually rather efficient. So,
I mean, Skype did what it could do because it was peer-to-peer. Underneath the hood, Skype was using all your bandwidth and using it to route calls. So the massive cost that normally other companies would have to front to route all of that bandwidth, they didn't have to face because they used the peer-to-peer network. However, that wasn't so clear because they had to remove a lot of that messaging to avoid these kinds of problems. Kazaa ran into problems, LimeWire ran into problems, a whole bunch of companies ran into problems. Many of them, because they had a bunch of hubris and said, oh yeah, we're like cool with all this like bad uses, and that is like a surefire way to get you shut down. But there were many companies that had to completely shed any notion of peer-to-peer and hide the fact that they were doing peer-to-peer. Not exactly fully hide. You could, if you knew what you were doing and you knew the networks, you could know that Skype was peer-to-peer underneath the hood, but it wasn't like lumped into the same category, right? And that enabled a business that would have been extremely difficult to scale without that.
I think another good example, like as a difference from the early 90s to now, I'm older too. Anyway, a big example is it's now easier to transmit value that isn't just bandwidth. You know, BitTorrent was about bandwidth back and forth, but a great example is Swarm, which is a bandwidth and storage and ether, right? So there's sort of that dynamic, that market that exists. And once there's opportunity for people to make dollars in different ways or other cryptocurrencies, then new forces emerge, and it can actually help to drive exponential growth of the people behind it, right? So even crowd sales, et cetera, this is money flowing into the ecosystem, partly by people incentivized to make money, but it's actually helping the builders. That's healthy.
thank you. More questions from the audience.
I just want to add to Juan's point about regulatory backlash. I think we need to be very careful around the things that we are now able to do around financial things. So we can create completely decentralized derivatives trading platforms and let anyone create their own derivatives and sell them to their friends. So, my personal feeling is that that's not a tool that I want to build right now, because it's gonna make it would basically be illegal to use that tool. So we have to engage with regulators and say these are things that will be possible with this technology, but this technology can also help you do your job better. So that's kind of the message. And so it's very easy to just rush ahead and say, oh, we can do this. I don't need permission from anyone. But we do live in a society, and it's we need to be thoughtful, basically.
Thank you. There was one more question over there.
Yes, one quick question. I'm trying to put it in the right words. I'm not as smart as you guys, so please bear with me. If you're rationalizing away, or if you're making everything so efficient by decentralizing everything, how do you think, for example, entrepreneurs or people building new things will be incentivized to stay decentralized? Because what you just said was, Skype and these others used certain particular, peer-to-peer and decentralized ways of benefiting, but eventually building their own business that way. So how do you make sure that people can, trust the decentralized nature and still build a business? Maybe I'm looking at it from a too capitalistic view, but that's kind of...
You will always need a lot of people working extremely hard to build products. Great products are difficult and expensive to build. So that will still be something that people will have to pay for in some way. What these kinds of networks create is a pressure to really think about your business model and figure out what part of doing that is actually necessary, meaning what part cannot be automated away by a network. And if you have a business that could be replaced by a script, you are in trouble. And you will be replaced by a script eventually. A lot of businesses have this problem. The issue that you need to be concerned with is say, great, what can we offload to the network and run as a protocol? And what do we provide of value to this network that will continue being a source of value that we have to keep inputting, and build a business around that, around something that's more stable and secure and really needed by the network. If what you're doing is not needed, then you shouldn't exist.
And I also think that these services, what all these platforms are doing is they're commoditizing a core set of services, right? And it's making it much easier to build these applications, and it's allowing you to focus on, as Juan said, exactly what the value add that you provide that no one else can provide. And what that's, I think, is going to do is going to liberate everyone, and it's going to push the innovation up, and there's going to be a lot more experimentation because it's going to be so much easier to build apps. Like, imagine not having to worry about storage, not having to worry about user management at all, right? Not having to worry about authentication or any of these things. And then all of a sudden you can just build an app very quickly and simply, and it's easier for you, and you can focus on things and have have more thought and effort put into that core functionality.
Doesn't the space to make money get smaller and smaller? Or is there kind of no ceiling?
I don't think so. I think what it does, one thing it does is it actually increases competition, but you will still see breakout successes for whatever effect. Like, there can be other network effects or other types of things that have emerged. I mean, just look at the Apple App Store, right? Like, it heavily increased competition across a wide variety of categories. There's a lot of note-taking apps, a lot of calendars, and so on. But there's still some very, very high-quality products that break out.
Yes, but the App Store is a good example of how difficult it is to make money on such a platform.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people it will be difficult to make money, but there will still be breakout successes. But at the end of the day, the consumer heavily, heavily wins. And also, because it significantly decreased the threshold, like the amount of work that it took to build one of those applications, you can have people who have full-time jobs who are just building a tiny application. Maybe it's hard to make money on the App Store. Maybe it's a lifestyle business and you make $500,000 a year or whatever. And I know that's a really good lifestyle business, right? But these kind of and yes, it's difficult to make money, but what we're doing is we're democratizing this and allowing way more people to have access to make $50,000, $500,000 a year.
I would suggest that, it's broadening the scope of platforms, and as there's more platforms, there's platforms for VR and for AR and all this. This is platforms for cloud computing and related, it's unlocking new capabilities too, so we might see, 10x the opportunities, especially as it interplays with these other platforms emerging. It's much easier to do VR apps now compared to 10 years ago. So this actually unlocks a lot of potential with, networking related apps and identity and IP and all of this, right?
Okay, on that optimistic note, thank you very much. On to the next speaker.